Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be solving problem 197, rising temperatures, which is an SQL problem rated easy. So this should be fairly quick. Now I'm just going to give you a second to pause and take a look at the question. Essentially what we're supposed to do here is logically traverse the rows and then pull out the ID of that row which has a higher temperature than the previous row. So we're basically looking at just two rows at a time and comparing them to fetch the greatest one. So let's get started. As you know, with every solution, I like to start with the select from where template. So we know we need the ID in the output. So I'm going to select ID from weather, which is the name of the table, where temperature is greater than or higher than the previous days or the previous row's temperature. So now how do we solve for that? I'm going to use the concept of nested queries to select the temperature of the previous row. So the syntax is going to look similar to what we have in the outer query. I'm going to say select temperature from weather. Now keep in mind here that we are selecting the temperature in this case, whereas in the outer query we want the ID. And when we're using nested queries, we need to alias the tables, especially when we're using the same table twice. This prevents ambiguity and SQL is able to execute without errors. Okay, so I just want to take a step back here for a moment. If you look at the table structure on the left, it seems as if ID is the primary key and it's ordered in an ascending manner, and each date corresponds to one ID, which is unique. If you're familiar with the concept of nesting, then you know that when we nest queries, the outer query is the main query or the final query whose output that we will see on the screen. So you must kind of visualize this outer query as traversing through every single row. If you again take a closer look at the logic of the query, essentially we are joining the table to itself, but when we join it with this nested inner query, there is going to be a lag of one row, and that's what's going to help us kind of compare the second row with its previous row. I want to elaborate this further by doing a quick code walkthrough, and by code walkthrough we actually substitute the values in the code as we solve for it. For example, let's start with the outer query at ID equals 1, which is the first row. So we select ID from whether where temperature is greater than, so we're checking if temperature 10 is greater than the previous row. Now there is no previous row to ID number 1, so the condition is not satisfied and the code just moves on to the next row. So right now the outer query is pointing to row number 2 or ID number 2. So here we check if the temperature 25 is greater than the previous temperature, and how. So at this point, keep in mind A is pointing to 2. So A dot ID minus 1 is actually 1. So in the inner query, we are fetching temperature where A dot ID equals 1, which is going to give us 10. Now in the outer query, we have the value 25 for temperature, and in the inner we have the value 10. So when we compare it, the condition is satisfied, and so our query will return ID number 2 as shown in the output. Okay, let's move on and run this code. As you can see, we have the right answer here, but let me try submitting this code. Okay, so it says the answer is wrong, which is an indication that the code did not pass one of the test cases. Okay, let's take a closer look at what went wrong and troubleshoot this query. So if you can see the input row on the left, we see that the first row, ID 1, actually has a date of 16th December, whereas the second row, ID number 2, has a date of 15th December. So we were wrong in our assumption when we thought that ID equals 1 would correspond to the lower date, whereas second row would correspond to the higher. They are actually not ordered according to the ID, and it can be random, which is actually not specified in the question here. So we cannot be using the ID to traverse to the previous row because the previous row may not contain the previous date. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the ID part in the query with the date. Hang on a second, let's go back to the code walkthrough again. Now imagine the outer query is sitting at or pointing to ID number 2, the second row. So we need to fetch the previous date this time, not by mentioning the ID of the previous row, but by saying the current date, which is 2nd January 2015 minus 1, which goes back to 1st January 2015. So it's a simple replacement. Instead of using ID minus 1, we are just going to use date minus 1, and in SQL there's a function called date add, which you can use to subtract one day from the date. So I'm just going to give you a second to pause the video here and take a look at the syntax. And next we're going to proceed with running this query, and then we'll see if it passes all the test cases. And there we have it. So this was my solution to the rising temperatures problem. If you enjoy this video and learned something new, do give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and comment below if you have any other approach to solving this problem, or if you have any questions. Also feel free to drop in a comment. I'll see you around in my next videos. Until then, keep practicing, keep SQLing. Bye now.